My name is Kathleen Spain Palo, and these are my memories from growing up at North Star Camp. My grandparents, William and Florence Spain, came from Wisconsin. Grandpa worked for a railroad there as a brakeman, and it was there that he lost his leg in an accident and had to wear a wooden leg, which was very painful for him. My grandparents moved to northern Minnesota in 1901, where Grandpa accepted a job as a depot agent for the railroad, where he was making just $35 a month. He handled all the rail business both at Hackensack and at Lothrop, a town just a few miles north, which no longer exists. Most of the freight shipped out of Hackensack was lumber, poles, and ties. Seeking additional income, Grandpa built a small store in front of their dwelling on Main Street. Since railroad regulations forbade my grandpa from owning a store or a second job, it was put in my grandma's name. Problems arose when the town's tough logging men didn't approve of a woman owning a business. To intimidate and get their point across, my grandpa's motor launch, which was said to be the fastest on Birch Lake, was dynamited. Also, their barn was mysteriously burned to the ground. In 1906, Grandpa built the Hotel Endeavor in Hackensack, which Grandma had named based on a slogan said, "We endeavor to please." Grandpa continued to work as a depot agent while Grandma took charge of the hotel. The ground floor of the hotel was occupied by retail stores, and outdoor in the back of the store, they kept the cattle and the chicken hogs in a large garden, selling fresh produce to the residents. In 1912, my grandparents acquired North Star Camp on Woman Lake from Eber Smith when he defaulted on a loan that was made to him by my grandfather. Smith was an old family friend of my grandparents. The North Star Camp land was originally owned by William Kleiman Yaki, a wealthy Detroit lumber baron. Yaki acquired the property from the federal government in 1883. At that time, he already owned over 50,000 acres of timberland. What Vanderbilt was to railroad, the Carnegie was to steel, Yaki was to lumber. He operated a lumber camp on North Star property until the late 1890s. Yaki then sold the property to Eber Smith in the early 1900s. Eber Smith operated the camp for about 10 years, advertising in local newspapers. At that time, he also operated a satellite camp on Rice Lake, about 10 miles east of North Star. When my grandparents acquired North Star, it consisted of 7 log cabins and a log lodge. The logs for the building were all harvested from the property. The timbers in those days were very large, and the logs across the front of the lodge were 54 feet in length and had very little size difference from end to end. The lodge was pretty much just a shell of a building at that time. Little by little, my grandparents expanded the property, building 5 additional cabins and erecting a number of other buildings. When they had finished, there were a total of 12 cabins, a barn, a garage, a pig pen, 2 chicken coops, and an ice house. The cabins at North Star were very primitive, consisting of 2 rooms. The first room was the kitchen and living room area, with a table and 4 chairs, an ice box, a cupboard, a little stove for cooking, a cot, and a wood-burning stove. The back room had 2 full-size beds, complete with a small dresser and a chamber pot. The wood and the pump were located at the main lodge, and ice was delivered to the guests on a daily basis for their icebox. My grandparents had 6 children in birth order: Margaret, William, Wheeler, Ella, Elsie, and Helen. Grandpa had a heart attack and fell in my dad's arms on December 22nd of 1931. My father, Bill Spain Jr., was born on July 13, 1904. the second of the 6 children. Dad grew up at the resort except for a few years that they lived in town. He earned a mining engineering degree from the University of Minnesota and then moved to Butte, Montana in 1927 to work in a copper mine. He and Mom returned to North Star in 1930, where he worked as a surveyor for the rest of his life. He was also a Woodrow Township constable until he died. As a young man, Dad was a sheriff with a 10-star. He wore a .45 Smith & Wesson revolver and holster around his waist and tied to his leg. He ran for the state senate in 1938 and lost by 132 votes. There had been a little boy who was lost up in Pine River, and he'd spent a week helping search for him, and he was never found. Dad felt that his searching for the boy, instead of campaigning, probably hurt his chances. He was the Woman Lake Association secretary for 14 years. Dad tried to join the Army in World War I. His father had to go and retrieve him and tell the officials that he was only 13 years old at the time. What Dad had done was have his mother sign a blank piece of paper. Then he wrote above her signature a note that said that she gave her consent for him to join. Yeah, it was pretty sneaky. However, during World War II, Dad served as in the Seabees and became a chief petty officer. Dad and some of his siblings attended the one-room schoolhouse at Woman Lake for at least part of their schooling. It was located on the Spain's property just west of the lodge. My mother even taught school there for a while. When I was a teenager, Mom showed me how she got to the schoolhouse. There was a very muddy, swampy area where Grandpa had put logs next to each other to form sort of a road to drive on or walk across. I was surprised because I thought I knew every part of the resort, but I hadn't looked deeper into the woods. It was all dried up when we were there, only broken logs were there, but the remains are still visible from the air. Both Dad and his sister attended high school in Pine River, and that's where he met my mom, and as she and her family were living in Pine River at the time. Grandma would pay room and board for them for the school months. Winter months on rural roads was very difficult. Coming home for Christmas vacation could come down to how the roads were at that time. It was a 30-mile one-way trip. My dad always carried a gun. When he was a young man, he was a sheriff with a star badge. He had his .45 Smith & Wesson revolver strapped to his leg, and he was a very good shot. I saw him throw a tin can up in the air, and he would not draw his gun until it started to fall downward. He could keep that can up in the air until he ran out of bullets. I barely remember the .45 strapped to his leg, but I do remember the .45 automatic that he always had tucked in his belt. He never went anywhere without it. Even if he was just going down the hill to get water, he would take the gun with him. Since we were so isolated in our own little world, I used to wonder who or what might be out there that he needed to take that gun. Because of that, I never liked to go out to the outhouse by myself at night. I was nervous about what could be lurking out there. Mom would time her baking in the winter months so that by the time the bus dropped me off and I walked in the door, the cookies or donuts would be nice and hot and waiting for me. She was good that way. She liked to bake and won prizes at the county fair for her donuts. North Star was self-sufficient. The cows provided milk and cream as well as meat for in the winter. We sold eggs and chickens too. The pigs ate the garbage and gave us pork. We had our own dairy truck in which we delivered our own milk, cream, and eggs. Helen is shown here with our delivery truck. In the spring, we would tap the maple trees and make our own maple syrup. The syrup that we made was for our own use. Dad was a former 6th District commander, and his pet project had always been having a maple syrup day at the Veterans Administration Hospital. It takes 35 gallons of sap, a drip at a time, to turn into a gallon of syrup. Mom liked wood that would burn hot and even when she was making bread or pies. When they finished at our place, the next time would be at a different home. The outhouse, sometimes called Mrs. Jones, was always very interesting. There were 2 holes in our own private privy, but the one for the campers to use had 4 holes. It was partitioned off in the middle, so one side was marked for the men and the other side was for the women. Every time I had to visit there, I would open the door wide and survey the area for spiders. I wanted to know exactly where each one was before I went in and sat down. If any spider moved, I was out of there. Ice was cut from the lake in the winter and stored in the ice house. Each block was about 2 feet thick square, depending on how deep the ice had frozen on the lake that winter. The ice house itself was hidden deep within the trees so that the sun wouldn't melt the ice. The ice was packed with layers of sawdust on all sides and all top and in between each block. In the early days, guests would arrive by train in Hackensack and would be taken by horse and wagon to the camp, a 3 to 4 hour trip one way. Later, the camp had its own car. Dad and Wheeler had to go to town to meet the midnight train and pick up our guests, often having to make 2 trips for all the passengers and luggage. Each time having to cross that rickety old bridge that ran across the river between Woman and Child Lake. The lodge sat at the highest elevation on the property, looking down at the lake and also down the row of cabins that lined the lake. The main lodge was beautiful, and a lot of effort was put into it to provide a place of rest and comfort. Inside, the dining room and the fireplace room were adjacent to each other, so you could pass back and forth into each room. The fireplace room had several chairs and a pump organ and a long table with reading material on it. There was a small writing desk, a wicker bench, and a large showcase that had old fishing lures and other interesting things in it. Guests would be served their meals in the dining room, which had 6 or 7 tables in it, each setting 5 to 6 people. In the fall, Grandma would sometimes have what might be called a harvest dinner. Some tables were also set up in the fireplace room for this special occasion. This day was open to any friend and neighbor who wanted to eat a meal of a salad, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and gravy, corn on the cob, string beans, fresh bread, and dinner rolls, and homemade jam. All had been prepared by Grandma and a few close friends of hers who also waited on the tables. Oh, and did I mention that there are several kinds of pies for dessert? Now, if you went out one of the doors from either the fireplace room or the dining room and through the screened porch and down the stairs, you would find a floating dock that provided dry access to the boats. The boats would be pulled up on the floating dock, making it easy for the women in their long dresses to get in and out without getting their shoes or their dresses wet. There was also a place to launch your boats at the boat landing further down the lakeshore, just past cabin number 9. The boats were stored in a boathouse for the winter, also located down at the landing. Fishing, of course, was the main attraction at North Star. My dad would work as a fishing guide and also make a shore lunch for the fishermen. He also repaired the boat motors as needed. While most of our guests came in the summer to enjoy the lake, hunting in the fall was also a popular attraction. We had plenty of ducks and pheasants. There were no campers or hunters in the winter, except my dad and 2 brothers always went deer hunting, often with some of the neighbor men. We always had venison to eat. My dad, William Joseph Spain, also known as Bill, and my mother, Evelyn Marie Ralia, were married December 29, 1926. They had 4 children, William Byron, Patricia Evelyn, Charles Burton, and 9 years later, me, Kathleen Lou. By the time I was born in 1942, there had already been many changes at North Star. With Grandpa gone and no income for Grandma, they had to sell off about everything. I only remember a few cows, a pig, lots of chickens, and a large garden. Little by little, without me even being aware of it, finally all of the animals had disappeared, and then we only had the chickens in the large garden. Then, after they butchered the chickens before the winter, we didn't get any new chicks. Mom, however, raised rabbits, who I thought were for my enjoyment. I had no idea that we were eating them. That helped us get through the winter months, though. As a teen, I took part in the washing of the clothes with the old Wringer washing machine. It was quite an effort to do a wash back then. Dad would pump the water, filling 3 large tubs and a vat the night before. He would get up around 5 a.m. and go down to the laundry room, which was attached to the lodge, and get the fire in the stove going so that there would be hot water in the vat to put into the washing machine. A bench was behind the machine where the 3 tubs of water sat. When the clothes were done washing, they would be put through the wringer and then dropped into the first tub. That's where they would receive their first rinsing. Through the wringer and to the next tub was the second rinse, followed by the third tub, which contained bluing to make the clothes look nice and bright. Then once more through the wringer, and then it's ready to hang out on the line. We lived in the cabin on the hill, which was cabin number 10. An L-shaped addition was added in the late 1920s to give us room for our family of 6. Even now, I wonder how we all fit in. There were only 2 bedrooms, one for my parents and one for the kids. But I remember my sister Pat saying there was a rollaway bed that they rolled into the living room for her at night. By the time I got out of the crib, my brother Byron joined the Army, and after Pat graduated, she went to Minneapolis to work. Burton joined the Seabees, a branch of the Navy, a couple years after graduating, after he decided that working inside at a desk was not for him. Summers at North Star were filled with joy and leisure, for me anyway. There really wasn't much for me to do each day but lay around and go swimming. Once in a while, I was able to talk Mom into coming to the landing just to watch me swim. But I was never able to talk her to go in the water with me. Swimming alone wasn't much fun. I did have one friend that lived 3 miles north of us, but her parents also owned a resort, and she had to work most of the time, and she seldom was given time for fun. Grandma had quite a few cane poles on the porch that we used for fishing. I would dig my own worms, and the garden was a gold mine for worms. Then I would get in the boat, push the boat out in the water, and toss the anchor overboard, waiting to catch some perch. I wasn't allowed to go out very deep from the ages of 6 to 10. When I got old enough to use a motor, then I could troll for northern and walleyes. Burton was my teacher for teaching me the art of catching a fish and also how to run the motor. One summer, I was probably 15 or 16, I decided I was going to conquer my fear of the cabins at night. I decided to move into cabin number 8 for the summer. Mom and Dad helped me with the move. While Mom and I were making the bed, a bat decided to join us. As it flew over our heads, Mom and I dove into the bed and covered ourselves with the blankets. Dad eventually caught it and released it outside into the night. It was very hard to make myself stay in the cabin so far away from our house, but somehow I managed to make it there for a whole month. Winters were pretty bleak. As a child, I was sometimes afraid during the winter months. All of the cabins were so dark and empty, and the trees were also empty of their leaves, so the camp looked really spooky. The lodge was the scariest of all. All those rooms within the lodge held mystery and abandonment in my mind. It got kind of lonely sometimes. Sometimes on a still, cold winter night while lying in my bed, I could hear the train whistle in Hackensack, which was 12 miles away. Also at night, we could hear the lake moaning from the minus 30 to 40 degree weather. It was such a terrible sound, it was very sad. It seemed to me that the lake was crying out for help. My bed was next to the wall, and when the wind was from the northwest, I could feel the breeze in my face. Nice and cold. I liked it. We used several heavy blankets to keep us warm. Since our only source of heat was from the cook stove, Dad would have to pack it full of wood at night and set the dampers just so. He didn't want it to burn fast. Even so, he would have to get up at the night and pack it in the wood again, enough to last till morning. Every fall, Dad would check the chinking between each log, looking for areas that needed to be filled with oakum. In the spring, the wind would break up the ice and push it up onto the shoreline. I remember that some piles of the ice being higher than me. I attended school in Hackensack. It seemed like a long walk in the winter to catch the bus. I was the first one on the bus in the morning and the last one delivered home at night, so it was a long day for me. In the mornings, I could never be sure if I'd missed the bus or not, and it got very cold standing there waiting. Many times I'd have to trudge back home and have Dad take me to town. In May of 1955, my dad made a terrible discovery in one of the cabins. His sister Ella and her husband George had not been seen all day. They had arrived the day before for a visit and stayed in cabin 5. Dad decided to check on them and went to their cabin and knocked on the door. With no answer, he looked in the window and he saw George's body lying on the floor. He went inside and found them both dead. George had gotten up sometime in the early hours, according to all the footprints found in the sand, that he walked around North Star for quite a while. George had been suffering with some kind of pain that the doctors couldn't seem to find. Because of that, he had been committed to an asylum because they said it was all in his head. Ella had taken him out just the day before. He had shot Ella and wrapped her in the bed sheets, and then he'd turned the gun on himself. I became afraid to go to sleep at night and went to sleep between Mom and Dad. They arranged for me to go and stay with a friend for 3 days while things settled down. Cabin 5 was torn down after that, removing all the bad memories from sight. I'm not sure when North Star stopped operating as a resort. I understand that the license was not renewed because a state inspector said the cabin did not have supporting vertical logs and that the horizontal logs in the ground were showing signs of rot. However, a few guests that had been there before continued to come and visit the resort. There was so much upkeep with the resort that large, and Grandma didn't have the income to re-roof the cabins or paint the lodge. Since we lived on the property, Dad did small repairs and tried to keep the heavy snowfalls from building up on the roofs by shoveling off the snow. A heavy snowfall could cave in the roof. Today, all that remains of the original North Star Camp property are 3 cabins. My family home, which was cabin 10, a small cabin on the east side of the property, number 8, and one of the 2 larger cabins that were on the southern point near the lagoon, which was number 11. The foundations for the garage and the old school are still visible as well. All of my family is gone from me now, all waiting for me in heaven. The North Star Camp motto went as follows: as you leave these beautiful surroundings, Resolve to act now and in the future in such a way that generations to follow will also have the beautiful forests and sparkling waters to enjoy throughout their lifetimes. I am so very thankful to have been able to live at North Star and enjoy the outdoors, the lake, and the freedom that it offered. North Star still holds the most cherished memories of my life. This is Kathleen Spain, and I thank you for listening to my memories about North Star Camp.